Hello everyone, how are you doing? It's a real delight for me to be here. I think that this really is a wonderful conference, and the intersection of all the people that come along just make it a fantastic place to be. So I'm going to talk a bit about what I've been doing over the last 40 years. I was super pleased that Brian asked me to look back in design rather than looking forward. I think that's a whole other thing that we could talk about. But I just finished 5 years at Apple. I just tapped out in January there. And I wanted to talk a bit about something that I kind of resolved for me in the last 5 years working there, but really sort of came up for me or surfaced back in the late 90s when I was working in the UK mobile phone industry with Orange and actually all of the other players in the market at that time. So as Brian said, I've enjoyed a really sort of happy time in work. I started out as an industrial designer and very quickly discovered that what I wanted to do was interaction design. I'm going to talk mainly about my experiences at IDEO, the BBC and Apple, but everything I've done through these last 40 years, I think, obviously have informed where I am today. The first project I ever did that I got paid for was this. It's a PDA. There's an acronym that we've lost, for a company called Microwriter, who had invented a way of entering text using 5 keys and a kind of cording mechanism. And that really, if you like, sort of ignited my love of user interface, and in particular, physical user interface. And I've spent a fair bit of time doing that type of work. But not just that type of work. Most designers, and I'm no exception, are horribly insecure. And the way that we kind of deal with that is by showing you a long list of all the clients that we've worked for, and I'm no exception to that insecurity. But I've worked across a number of industries: retail, fast-moving consumer goods, so a fair sort of selection of stuff. I've never worked for a client whose name begins with Z. If there's anyone in the audience at this point, I'll do it for free. I just really need to get that final thing on this list. So what I want to talk about is almost a kind of pathology, if you like. I think that there are 5 things that are coming up for me that I think are sort of super interesting, and I'll go into these in a lot more detail in the next half hour. There's some bonus content. You can spot an obscure 80s Scottish reference. I'll talk a bit about my recent time with the Tartan Army and the space race in the 60s. Of course, those 3 things make a lot of sense together, don't they? Any of you that have come here for some Mac rumours, I'm sorry, you're going to leave slightly disappointed. I will talk at some length about Apple, but everything that I'm going to say will actually be things that you can go and find yourself out on public domain. So obviously I'll be trying to sort of point to certain things and stitch that together in a story. One of the things that you'll hear through this is a theme that I spoke about when I was here 6 years ago. I think that what I do is incredibly simple. There's really not that much to design. All design does is help you look at the world in new ways. It helps make ideas visible and tangible, and it helps you manage risk by trying stuff out in simple ways. It's not much more than that. That's quite a difficult message to sort of talk with master's students that I work with sometimes at the University of Dundee, because it seems like it should be more than that. But honestly, there's not much more to it than that. So these 5 patterns really are things that I've noticed in terms of the dynamics of organizations, the dynamics of how people try to apply creativity across different industries, and the way that human beings come together and sometimes manage to actually get some stuff done, but not always. And I think that underpinning all of that is really what I think I need to do, what I'm still trying to do in terms of my own personal practice. So this story begins in 1993. This was a piece of work that I did with my colleague Mark Tanner at IDEO, and it was for a company called Mercury 1-to-1. And we invented the fried egg key, which was something that essentially it was taking the 80% choice all the way through a user interface and presenting that to the user as a soft option in this big button on the right. It was a reasonably successful product. It helped Mercury grow their one-to-one mobile phone service. And for me, one of the biggest payoffs of my early career was sitting on a number 15 bus in London, and someone in the seat in front of me was showing their pal this phone and going, "This phone's really easy to use. Everything just comes up under this key and it always just works." And I remember thinking, maybe I'm doing something right here. That's just great. So I suspect that a great many of you in the room have never heard of one-to-one. And so a quick refresher of the UK mobile industry over the last sort of 30 or 40 years. Clearly, at the beginning of that industry, as it was forming, there was lots of different businesses. They were all combining and different companies were merging. And when I was working with them, there was a time of reasonable stability emerging around about the year 2000. And that we've enjoyed that for most of the last sort of 20 or 30 years. Obviously, BT have been all over the map here, continue to be there. And we're looking forward to seeing what happens when Vodafone and Three get together. And what we were doing at IDEO in 2003, bear in mind, Duncan Kerr at Apple was coming up with multi-touch. We were reaching the end of the feature phone. It had become about fashion, it was all about form, it was all about material, it was all about the things that, in retrospect, should have made us realize that we were at the end of the line for that product. But we didn't see it. I didn't see it. Certainly, most of my clients didn't see it. One of the ones that probably had a little bit more kind of ambition or sort of ability to see that things could be different was Vodafone. We designed an extraordinary sort of program for them to really design a sort of de-featured feature phone, something called Simply, which was launched reasonably successfully, but it didn't really fit with Vodafone's very kind of performance-oriented, feature-oriented sort of positioning. So was on the market for only a few years. It's been fascinating for me to see Punkt do what they're doing at the moment, because I think that there is genuinely a huge interest in the world for a simpler phoning experience. And then we were doing crazy things for people like Orange, who at that point, and when I think about this, it seems almost incredible, were sponsoring a nightclub called Manumission in Ibiza that had a reputation for extraordinary levels of hedonism at every event that they ran. And a mobile phone company was sponsoring them. And they asked us to create a set of 20 bar tables that allowed you to communicate through this upside-down plastic beer glass with the waiting staff. It was fun. And I think that the thing that sort of began to emerge for me, because at that point we were working for everyone. We were working for T-Mobile, O2, Vodafone, Orange and Three. They all knew that we were doing it. We weren't sort of doing anything dodgy. But just managing that and juggling that was a really sort of fascinating thing. But it seemed to me that they all sat on some kind of spectrum because they were all extraordinarily different to work with. I mean, it was almost like they had their own kind of character or sort of pathology, if you like. And so that was something that sort of was left hanging for me, how in a marketplace, single market, country market, that was really just emerging, how you have this incredible diversity of the way that people went about what they actually were doing. And so somewhere in that sort of spectrum, it sort of felt to me that the people like Orange and Three were much more, if you like, sort of creative or intuitive or speculative, and the folks on the left were much more sort of logical or procedural. And so back before this was a largely discredited theory, you know, can companies be left and right-brained? What's going on with that? That sort of felt like something that was definitely of interest. And so the way that I think about this is a sort of sense of balancing art and accountancy. I think all of these businesses had a sort of varying amount of those types of things going on within the way that they did work. Huge generalizations here, caveat, but it's a very, very different sort of way of doing it. And I think the thing that I've realized is that I've spent a very large part of my career actually helping clients almost kind of find some kind of balance between those two things. Back at IDEO, back in the day when we were doing a lot of sort of large-scale design thinking work, we worked with Procter & Gamble, doing products like this. And we realized quite early on that we were being massively disruptive in terms of the way that we were helping them find ways to do work. That's a genuine email that went to our client. And at that point, we panicked, frankly, and then began to realize that probably meant we were doing something right. But what we were doing for P&G was essentially helping them sort of move from the left-hand side of the spectrum into the middle. And then, if you like, on the flip side, we were also doing work for people like Prada, where we worked with OMA in their sort of retail store in New York, in Guggenheim. And for that, we designed this extraordinary interactive changing room that used a video screen and a video camera as a mirror. Everyone looks absolutely gorgeous in fancy clothes in slow motion, trust me on that. And it was a really sort of amazing sort of experience. We had a whole bunch of sort of essentially kiosks, but enabled in a way that made them look like they were part of a fashion store, and even custom handheld devices back in the day. And I think what we're doing for those guys was essentially taking them from the right-hand side of this diagram into the middle. And the thing that kind of resolved for me when I got to Cupertino is a realization that that was actually at the very core of what Apple was and is. And I think that this is such a fundamental part of why Apple has been able to be successful. I think Steve Jobs personified that balance. He insisted, he demanded that balance from his teams, and that's still very much part of the ethos of the company. So that kind of sweet spot in the middle. And what's really amazing to me, actually, is how few businesses seem to naturally be able to inhabit that middle spot. I think that so many of us are working in businesses where what's valued is what can be measured, and that almost a kind of that the risk of a measured dive to the bottom is somehow more palatable than the risk of using a sort of creative or intuitive approach to what you're doing. So I think that's been something that's been a really, really important pattern for me. So I think the next one I want to talk about is how tribes are so much part of the work that anyone does in any sort of building. I was lucky enough to, unlucky enough to be at the Germany game a few weeks ago with my sons. And there's something extraordinary about being part of that type of tribe. Being on manoeuvres with the Tartan Army is a really kind of life-affirming sort of thing to be doing. But however, I think that human nature sometimes shows up in organizations. And for me, if culture eats strategy for breakfast, tribalism gets culture before it's even got out of bed. And as a leader, I think it's not something that we pay attention to, usually because we come from a tribe ourselves. And I think that managing or leading to try and get people to put their tribal sort of things to one side to actually sort of realize the goals of the company or the organization that they're part of, I think is a real challenge. And for me, they tend to be based on two different things. There's the economic differences, they've got more than we have, more profit, more resources, or the sort of, well, this is the way we do things, we don't believe in the way that you're proceeding. Random 80s music reference. And I think that these product groups play each other for resources and profits, and disciplines play each other for methods, tools, and process. That's something that I've tried in my career to really, really try and sort of mitigate in the way that I do things. And so I'm going to refer to, there's a paper in the Harvard Business Review, an article, many of you may have read it, if not, that I think is really, really fundamental in trying to understand how Apple is organized and how it's had this extraordinary track record of innovation over the last 20 years. And from that article, back in 1997, when Steve Jobs came back, the business was organized in business units, product business units, each with its own profit and loss. Steve Jobs came back and he fired all of the general managers in a single day and put the whole business under a single P&L and only had functional departments. Now, this is kind of about face. This is the way that a lot of startups choose to organize themselves, not the way that large organizations with hundreds of thousands of employees are. This is still the way it is. I still believe this is a fundamental thing that Apple does that makes it who it is. By organizing in that way, you actually manage to break something called Conway's Law, where essentially you organize the business in a way where the conversations and the communications between people have to be about joining the products together into an ecosystem rather than one product group trying to somehow play or game the folks in other product groups. And I think that that's something that's wonderful, and you experience it in a really kind of visceral way when you're working in Apple Park. I used to work at the BBC. There was some of that going on there, believe it or not. And one of the things that we did, I'm going to have to go get some water, I think, which I think is way over here. It's a very large stage, this. One of the things that a couple of my colleagues in BBC UX did, Paul Sissons and Paul Crowley, big shout out to the two of them, was that they decided that we needed to print out the BBC online. Just think about that for a second. Not your BBC online, just the BBC online, because that's the way it was organised. So partly it was to get a conversation about personalisation going with some of the tribes that we were dealing with. But what it did was make a whole raft of things that were essentially hidden visible. So we had 50 feet of A4 printouts. And we didn't capture every single page, but we captured every archetype, every sort of page format that we'd actually created. It was an amazing thing to do. And we then toured this around 4 cities in the UK and showed it to the top 200 people in the business, including Tony Hall, the Director General. And some extraordinary things happened when we actually pulled all the tribal leaders together. We were able to realize things like, we have a number of video players that are doing exactly the same thing, are completely different code bases, attached to completely different content management systems, with completely different look and feel. Don't you think we should do something about that? It really was a very, very useful way to try to make visible some of the differences that we had and find a way to actually sort of tackle them. Being tribal isn't all bad. It really isn't. I think that sort of modern workplaces, actually mean that we all end up sort of reverting back to that sometimes. In my experience, the functional organisation at Apple really makes a difference to that. The sort of design discipline, if you like, of making things visible is a great way to start to get different tribes to start talking to each other. So the third thing I wanted to talk about was how businesses are really sort of set up to hide things. It's just something that is very, very natural. And I think that the modern nature of work, the fact that many of us are not in the same place, in the same building all the time, the digital nature of work, we don't make widgets anymore, we make these things that are hidden on networks and hard drives, that hiding things becomes a really, really big deal. Interestingly, in Berlin, scientists have taught rats to play hide and seek, and apparently they squeal with joy when they find each other. So it would seem it's something that is sort of deep in most mammals' sort of DNA. So I think that hiding is a flight response. It's what people do if they think that that someone's going to object to what they're doing, or going to argue with them, or create some kind of problem. I think that this idea of prototyping, I think, is fundamental to helping to uncover things like that. This is a prototype. It's a model of something that people are able to think about in the abstract, but once you actually are standing in a room where every single page in the BBC is up on the wall, it really, really helps you start to see things that you can't see before. Apple places prototyping at the very heart of everything it does. One of my first impressions of walking into the Apple Design Studio is just the sheer number of prototypes. There are literally thousands of them lying around in this huge room. The way that Apple does it, it's been doing this for 30-odd years, and I think is actually very special, and in a funny way is a sort of not-so-secret weapon that the business has. And so I'm going to talk through sort of 4 different types of prototyping that they do. Again, this is captured on a technical paper that Stephanie Hood and Charlie Hill did in 1997. Isn't that extraordinary? We still refer to that paper. They still refer to that paper. I'm obviously not used to being out the door yet. It's a really sort of important thing. So what designers tend to do are these kind of, what I started my career doing as these sort of look and feel prototypes. This was for a company called Electro Textiles, the founder of which Chris Chapman is somewhere in the room. This was a company that had invented a way of sensing using fabric. We built a whole series of models. This is one where it was literally a soft pillow that you could use as a fully functioning PC keyboard. And it didn't work. We didn't even know if it could work. It was just something we did to try and capture something that we thought would feel and look great. It did. The other sort of more sort of common engineering prototype is an implementation prototype, where you don't really care how it looks, you're not really sure what people are going to do with it, but you just want to be able to prove that you can actually build something. This is one of the first iPhones. It just sits on a big board with huge components that are not integrated or don't really work in the way that anything would for the final product. But it allowed the engineers to actually sort of figure out if it was possible to pull this hardware architecture together. The type of prototype that I've spent a lot of my career doing and printing out the BBC online is one of them. It's what they call a role prototype, where really you're trying to do something, try and figure out the value or how it might fit into people's lives. Typically, at IDEO, we would do things like this. On the left-hand side is a cardboard sandwich outlet that we built and ran in a London station for a day. It fell apart after a day, but we actually sold sandwiches off it, and it allowed us to understand that it was actually quite a bad idea to try and sell pret-a-manger sandwiches from essentially a garden shed. And so the project didn't go any further. But we'd only spent a few weeks and a few large sheets of foam core to figure out whether or not this was actually a useful thing or a potentially sort of a good idea. We didn't have to invent or build any sort of hard structures. On the right is some work we were doing for British Airways. We worked on the first lay flat bed in business class, and that's me and some of my colleagues playing in a cardboard fuselage tube with some chairs, just trying to figure out exactly how tightly could you pack people before it felt just a little bit too uncomfortable. That's pretty uncomfortable what we have there. And then I think that what lots of organizations do is that they try to create the perfect prototype by integrating the look and feel, the implementation, and the role right from the beginning. On the whole, I just find that that's a really, really difficult thing to do, and certainly doesn't allow ideas to be explored as fully as perhaps they could. So these types of integration prototypes, I think, are really very common in all sorts of different activities. And I think that this may be something controversial, but I think that sort of modern sort of front-end sort of UX builders essentially short-circuit that sort of process, if you like, of sort of looking at sort of multiple different parts of a design space. And so I think that integrated prototypes are incredibly valuable, but in my experience are best left to a sort of second or third round of work. So that's the Apple sort of prototyping triangle. And for me, I mean, I told you about the thousands and thousands of models that we would make at Apple. There really is a 100-to-1 ratio here, that 100 ideas maybe yield 10 things that you think are worth making, and that might lead you to one thing. And if you think about it, that means that you're running a 99% failure rate on your process. Right? That doesn't sound like a particularly smart thing to do, but actually, in my experience, that's something that really, really improves the quality of what you're creating. And at IDEO, we used to talk about this in terms of smart failure and dumb failure. Tom Kelly writes about this in the Art of Innovation book at some length. I'll talk a little bit what I mean about smart and dumb failure through a very sort of interesting day I had when I was the managing director of IDEO in London. I got 2 phone calls in one day. The first one was from a sweaty banker in New York. He was an English sweaty banker in New York. And the reason that he was so sweaty was that one of my project leaders had taken him and 5 colleagues on the New York subway in August. And the train had got stuck in a tunnel, and they'd been in there for 40 minutes, and they hated it. So as soon as he got out, he called me and told me that this was a disaster. I should fire my project leader immediately, and it's just, how dare I sort of mess with that. So I talked to her, and I think she was trying to do something really interesting. They were trying to figure out how to launch a new consumer financial product in New York. She felt that these folks were a little bit kind of fancy. They didn't have much connection with everyday people in New York, so she thought she'd take them on the subway for 10 minutes, which kind of went a bit wrong for her. But honestly, it felt that was a pretty sort of interesting thing to try. A bit later in the day, I got another phone call from a West Coast US tech leader for a client who we had created a series of prototypes and reference designs for. And he was absolutely overjoyed. Thank you so much. The stuff that you guys did completely surpassed all of our expectations. Our customers love it. It's the best dog and pony show we've ever had. Unfortunately, I was just preparing myself to have a really, really difficult conversation with a colleague. We'd worked for this client for 3 years in a row, and every single year we had spent more on materials than we actually had on fees that we got back. So actually it had been a total disaster from our perspective, even though we'd made the client really, really happy. And so this was a bit of dumb failure. My colleague who took the bankers on the subway was a piece of smart failure. I think that really, really sort of managing businesses or managing your teams so that people are willing and happy and feel safe enough to try to do something that might not work out, for me has been one of the sort of most important things that I've tried to do in the teams that I've been running. So which one do I reward? I still had the awkward conversation, and I did actually give a promotion to the project leader later that year. Our workplaces are hunting grounds. We've still got this sort of primitive instincts. People get scared. People want to hide things because they think that if anyone finds out about it and it's not quite right, then they're going to be in trouble. I think trying to create a culture within an organisation that affords that uses prototypes to bring things out in the opening, that embrace, expect and manage smart failure is absolutely the way to go. This next part is about, so I've been talking quite a lot about organisational structure. This part is a slightly more granular level, if you like, where I want to talk a bit about project structure. This is probably one of the most important things that I've ever learned in my entire life. Obviously, I'm making a kind of play on the Orwell Animal Farm, 4 legs good, 2 legs bad. And the reason that I'm talking about this is that I believe that all innovation projects are not the same. I believe that there are 4 key patterns, and they're not just the argument between agile and waterfall. Now, I know that there's people in this group, this community, that care very deeply about this type of thing, so it'll be interesting to see how you respond to this. The reason I got into that was that in 2002, I had 2 colleagues, 2 male colleagues, who I found having what might be described as a dust-up in the studio. This was absolutely shocking because IDEO was a very kind of cool, groovy place. People were incredibly respectful. Just didn't get that kind of thing happening. And moreover, these 2 guys were one of my sort of crack teams. They were always working together and knew each other really very, very deeply. So to see the 2 of them, at loggerheads in this way was a really, really sort of strange sensation. I just didn't quite know what was going on. So, how could that high-performing team suddenly be so lost? And trying to understand that question, that's what I learned by sort of trying to understand that, was probably the most amazing thing that I've done in terms of my career. I learned from this guy. Eddie Obeng is a professor at Ashridge Business School. He has his own business, Pentacle. And for me, he is the world's leading project management consultant. Eddie worked really, really closely with IDEO. He's one of the reasons that IDEO was able to turn itself from being a sort of jobbing design agency into an innovation management consultancy, because he really, really understands how projects work. And what Eddie says is that he asks 2 questions. He asks, when any new project comes along, ask 2 questions. Do we know what we want? And do we know how to do it? And you'll get an answer back that's, to a greater or lesser extent. And I am a recovering consultant. There is a 2x2 in this presentation. I do apologise for that. But if you sort of plot that out, then you get, a sort of series of different kind of project typologies, if you like. And I'm about to go through these in a bit more detail. This is the slightly controversial thing I'm going to say. I'm going to argue that waterfall and agile are in these sort of 2 right-hand corners of this. And I'm already anticipating the agile tribe coming after me at the round table. And so if you sort of go, what I'm going to do is, this is where I'm going to use my space race metaphor to explain all of these different sort of projects. And so when I was a kid, this was a huge big deal. I remember sitting with my parents, aged 6 years old, watching Neil Armstrong step on the moon. Many of you will remember that the Americans and the Russians were in this race to get people into space. And how might that have mapped onto Eddie's sort of project typology? Well, if you want to put someone on the moon, at some point you're going to have to build some kind of vehicle, and you better know what you want, and you better know how to do it. And pretty much any project, anything that makes it out into the world, goes through this top right-hand box, that you have to do projects that allow you to actually sort of build and deliver something. In the top left-hand corner, is it really about having a very, very clear goal, but maybe not really understanding how you're going to do it? And I'm imagining at some point in NASA, somebody said, let's put a person on the moon. Wouldn't that be amazing? How are we going to do that? Well, let's work on it. Let's figure out what's the best way to actually sort of make that happen. A lot of typical design projects, a lot of fast-moving consumer goods folks are working in that sort of top left-hand corner, where very, very clear understanding of what customers want, often through deep customer research, but a flexibility about the technology or the enablers that you're going to use to make that happen. Bottom right-hand corner, where you maybe, Eddie calls it a movie, I like to call it a zigzag project. Where essentially, maybe back in the day, the guys at NASA figured out they had this rocket motor technology that they'd stolen from the Germans in the Second World War, and then maybe we could use that as a way to somehow, create. What could we do with that? Well, we could put a man on the moon. Wouldn't that be interesting? And I think that the majority of tech industry projects are exactly in this sort of quadrant, where we have a technology and we're really trying to find the best way to realize either customer or monetary value out of it. Which leaves this bottom left-hand corner, the projects where we don't know what we want and we don't know what we're doing. Sort of traditional sort of project management would tell you that that's not something you should ever do. In my experience, the organizations that are able to go into that quadrant and trust their hunch, trust intuition, are the ones that will do the breakthrough thinking. I mean, think about it. These are the folks that are willing to do something that just feels completely counterintuitive. And I think this links back to that kind of balancing art and accountancy thing. And that's something that certainly the folks at Apple are very, very adept at. And who knows, maybe in my space race metaphor, maybe there was some kind of thing the American government is going, we've got to find some way to show those dang Russians what's what. And, maybe it was a very kind of sort of abstract, sort of ambiguous sort of goal. The guys from NASA said, hey, let's put a man on the moon. We've got this rocket motor from Germany. And sure enough, they eventually sort of make it all happen. So understanding this and managing teams differently, depending on which quadrant you're in, is what it's all about. Fog projects are very, very different. It's all about sort of time boxing it, making sure that you're really looking after the emotions of the team. Teams get lost. And that's what was happening to the two guys having a dust-up in my studio. They'd enjoyed a lot of success. They were used to delivering on what they were being asked to do. And inadvertently, we thought it was a paint-by-numbers project, but it was actually a fog. And they were just falling apart emotionally in terms of their ability to do it. So that answered that question for me. Obviously, paint-by-numbers projects are about, rigorously managing your resources, seamless handoffs, charting the sequence of resources and tasks over time. Movie projects or zigzag projects are more like a sort of pivoting. You try one prototype at a time, learn from it, pivot, do something better the next time. And quest projects are a little bit more around sort of parallel working. You maybe have 2 or 3 different teams working together, working separately, and then you make sure that you bring them together to review and compare who seems to be actually sort of making progress, and eventually one way of doing things actually prevails. And so for me, there's no one-size-fits-all to project management. I think it's much more than agile. I think that one of my frustrations at my career at the BBC would be that everything was done as an agile sprint. That just doesn't work in my opinion. I think that it works for a great many things, especially in the tech industry, but it's not the sort of be-all and end-all of innovation projects. Arguably, multivariate testing is a short-form quest within a movie structure. So what that means, of course, is that any given product or project program, you actually end up moving quite dynamically and at different levels of granularity through that map. And understanding that is something that, for me, the sort of best ninja PMs that I work with really, really understand how to make that work. So I'm going to finish up in the last couple of minutes just with some things that I have found to underpin this in terms of my personal practice. This is my guitar. I've been playing it for 40 years, and I'm a pretty poor guitar player. All right? So, and finally, when I practice, I get a little bit better, but I'm still never going to be there. I have a lifetime worth of joy and frustration in this instrument. This is Brian Leese. He leads the prototyping team at Apple Industrial Design, and he exemplifies one of Apple's leadership traits, which is that you must be an expert and immerse yourself in the details of projects, even as a leader. The Apple Design Studio is populated with dozens of these picnic tables. And the way that work gets done is that people lay work on the table, everyone gathers around about it, and you collaboratively debate. You're not there to pitch, you're not there to sell, you just put the work on the table and you're expected to engage in an honest and respectful multidisciplinary dialogue about what the best idea is. That's one of the fundamentals of why Apple is successful. And you can read all about this in that How Apple is Organized for Innovation paper. The third thing is that, again, this is something that Apple talks about. And then when you go there as a leader, they train you in this. Joel Podolny is the head of Apple University. And you actually sort of understand and become indoctrinated in the way that the company works. I'd like to think that they hired me because I was sort of predisposed to work in that way. But this sort of discretionary skill to know when to step back on the sidelines and let other people be the experts and immersed in the detail is a really important part of how this scales at Apple. This is a really old-fashioned diagram from the 1920s. Some of you will be seeing an old lady looking down and out of the image. Others of you will be seeing a young woman looking out looking to the right and behind. So being able to live with that type of ambiguity turns out to be something that becomes really important in leadership of this type of work. Doing a fog project doesn't work for everyone. A lot of people just can't do it. They just find the ambiguity too difficult. This was my senior team at the BBC, and we did a UX workshop at Design Manchester, called Design Circus. And so there's something about that culture that we had at the BBC where we figured out how to play as part of our work. And I think that if you're playful, then you enable creativity and you do something to sort of pull back from that sort of fear that I think so many people have in their organizations. I'm a minute over, I promise you I'm really finished. Then the final thing is something that I think is fundamental to the way I am as a human being, but preferring to offer ideas and questions over opinion and critique. That sounds counterintuitive for a creative director, but certainly that's been my experience in terms of how you actually sort of make all of this stuff sort of work together. So I think change happens one colleague at a time, and it has to start with me. It takes repetition, it takes discipline, just like trying to learn how to play my guitar. It also takes humility. I really like the idea that I'm still practicing. I've been doing it for 40 years, but I'm still practicing. So just to summarize, what I've talked about today is that the best businesses that I've worked with are able to balance art and accountancy, that they hold both of those in equal regard and pull them together. The leaders that I love to work with have done everything they can to mitigate that kind of superhuman sort of tribal nature and don't allow that to deflect them from the goals of the business or the culture that they want to create. People love to hide. Doing things like prototyping, making things visible is a really, really core discipline that design can help with. Project management is complex, and there are 4 key patterns, much more than just the waterfall or agile that most tech businesses use. And it all starts with you. It's all about your personal practice. Thank you very much.